Let's start with this topic that today I will present about source level analysis. I think that throughout the workshop and the conference, we are trying to understand how the brain works. But this is not easy because our brain is inside the skull, and these are our tools. How can we measure non-invasively our brains with EEG and with MEG? We get some electromagnetic fields that we should be able to convert into source activity. And this is not a easy task. That's why we use many mathematical approaches to try to model and estimate what's going on really behind the school in our brains. Why do we want to go from the sensor level to the source level? So, it's really good because it increases your spatial resolution, and it also disentangles some activity that in the sensors could be related very close together, like coming from the same source. So that way we can increase the source, the spatial resolution, and we can also disentangle this mixed activity from deep sources. So to reconstruct our brain activity to make the source reconstruction, we go from the sensors to the sources. This is what we call first to go to the sensors. From the sensors to the sources, we have to resolve the inverse problem. But first, we have to deal, as we have seen this morning, with the forward problem. That is, if we had a source in the brain, how it will project to our sensors. So first thing we have to be able to solve this forward model, the first thing we have to solve or to wonder or to feed the model is with sensor information. What's the sensor information? What sensors do we have? And which are their position with respect to the brain? Because this is not the same measuring that far than this close. So the second thing we have to take into account is the information about our head. Like how do currents flow from the sources in our brain, inside our brains, towards our sensors, throughout the tissues? And this is the important thing. We will have to model the head, as we have seen this morning, and probably you have been doing this throughout the hands-on session. And finally, estimate the sources. How do we model the source activity mathematically? So with these three things, we are going to start little by little, going through all of them. So information about the sensors, we can have EEG sensors or we can have MEG sensors. If we have MEG sensors, we could have magnetometers, axial gradiometers, and planar gradiometers. Each of them pick up sources at a different level. Some have more deep resolution, somehow the radial and planar gradiometer measure better the things that are more on the surface, like more next to the skull, on the cortex. So each of them, it's important to know. The model needs to know which kind of sensors you have. Then we have to do a very important step, and I think this morning everyone worked a lot, and John also explained it. It's the co-registration. So we have MEG data and we have MRI data, or a default template on an MRI. So how do we mix MEG or EEG together with MRI? There's no information to link them other than our fiducials, or the points we really know where they are in the MRI, and we can mark them. And we also have these coordinates in the MEG or in the EEG. So imagine you have a functional MEG or EEG, then you will have some raw data, you have information about the channels, and you have the head points. These are the head points. These are not coils, these are not sensors. It's just like a representation of where your head should be. And at the same time, if we have the anatomy and the MRI, we will have the T1 or whatever MRI. Yeah, we often work with the T1 weighted, and we have to segment it because the MRI is just an image. So we have to stack the layers. Probably you also work on that this morning. And once we have segmented the layers, we also mark the fiducials, so they start aligned with the head points and the fiducials. We can now co-registrate where the helmet of the EEG or where the cap of the of the EEG or the helmet of the MEG is with respect to the MRI. And with this, we can construct, help to construct the forward model. And finally, the head. Um, we have to characterize the geometry of the head and also the conductivities of each of the tissues that are in the head. For that, we have analytical models that are like more simple, and they are spherical models where we approximate our head on a sphere. We can do a single share and or different overlapping spheres, and this is mainly these are very fast and they are like analytical, and these are mainly work for MEG because, as you know, magnetic fields are not that sensitive to the conductivity of each of the tissues in our heads. But for MEG, for EEG, it's recommended to have more realistic models, like numerical models. Also, MEG will benefit from them, but it's not that essential. So for these, we have the boundary element model, BEM, or the finite element models, FEM, and these are more accurate, as John was showing this morning, and allows you to make a more precise computation. So in addition to the sensors, to the head, we need information about the sources. How do we model the sources? So the current flow of neural activity at each source location can be modeled by the orientation of an equivalent current dipole. It is primarent currents, and because electric currents has to close the loop, we have also this volume of secondary currents. And as you know, these equivalent current dipoles can be oriented in different locations in the cortex, for example. And some of them, when they are perpendicular to the cortex, the EEG, the electromagnetic fields can go outside. However, the MEG is not that easy that it goes outside because uh, it's planar, it's tangential, so the field doesn't go out. Whereas the things that are tangential to the cortex, to the scalp, are more easily picked up by sensors that are outside. Not only EEG, but also MEG. So that's why often we often say that MEG picks up the tangential oriented sources in the brain, not that much the radial ones. So this information is also useful for our models. So now we want to estimate the source activity inside the brain, but how do we define the brain? So for this, we make a grid and try to estimate on the surface or on the volume and have different points that could just rely on the surface of the cortex or deep inside throughout the volume. In addition to that, we can also estimate, especially in the surface, constrained sources, which are normal to the cortex. And so they follow the orientation of the macro columns of pyramidal neurons that are oriented like this. Or we can use unconstrained sources. So at each point, we don't have only one source of activity, but three orientations. So this is important because it adds complexity in the analysis that we need to do afterwards. So we've been reviewing sensor information, head information, and the source model that we are going to use. Now we are ready to solve the inverse model. So we want to estimate the source brain activity from the measured sensor data. So as we were saying, this is not an easy problem because we have 300 sensors, approximately MEG, and we want to estimate 15,000 source activities in, like, it's several orders of, yeah, 2 orders of magnitude bigger. So this is an ill-posed problem because your inputs are very few and you need a lot of outputs. So this has infinite number of solutions. And we have to try to make constraints to make it solvable. Otherwise, yeah, it's really not, it's not going to work. So depending on which constraints you apply, we have different approaches to resolve this inverse model. We have dipole fitting, where the constraint, where we estimate one or very few sources in the brain, and the constraint we apply is okay. Let's just apply use very limit number of sources. For this, we have the single dipole that maybe you have heard of it, and another approach is to do distributed sources. For distributed sources, we want to minimize the residual and the noise of the data. And in this category, where we don't have not very little, few sources, but throughout the brain we estimate at each point, we have methods like the minimum norm estimation and approaches like Loretta or DSPM that maybe you have heard also. And John explained this morning. And we also have spatial filters where we assume independent sources, and the constraint we made is that we have to have a unit gain and a minimize the variance. And in this category is the beamformers that fall into it. And for some of these methods, we also need to estimate the noise covariance of the room or of the environment, and also the data covariance. So these are additional information that we may need to compute in order to be able to do these models. So, okay, now we have resolved the source model, and we want to analyze our data. First thing we have to think is, how do we estimate it? Or my source activity, is it a constraint normal to sources? In this case, we have to be very careful, because if we plot the activity of our sources, um, it could be different. The signals could have different signs. So if we want to imagine have a region of interest and we want to average the data inside this region of interest, we could have positive signals and negative signals depending on where in the cortex we are, because it's like has this gyros and sulcus. So for this, we have to be careful not to average out all the data, and then we end with nothing because positive cancels negative, and we destroyed our data. So for that, we often, or at least for visualization, we apply absolute values. In that way, we know like the activation. We have to be careful when we apply absolute values, because this could alter like the frequency of the signal. So maybe for visualization you can do it, but then we will see that when we apply to analysis, we have to be careful with a few things. When we have unconstrained sources, we have three orthogonal dipoles. So when we want to visualize, since we cannot apply three, we usually do like the norm of the three, and then we'll have. So if we applied absolute values, the thing doesn't change much. But how do when we have a research question, we have to also think on where do we, what are my regions of interest? Do I want to do and analyze the whole brain and estimate the whole amount of sources, or do we want to work on specific regions of interest, or do I want to use an atlas? It could be an anatomical atlas. There are different out there. So depending on this, you will have to organize your data, process your data differently. When you use an atlas, sometimes the regions are very big, and we will see now which methods do we have to work with this. But sometimes you don't work with the full atlas at the seeds, but you break a bit each of the regions so you have smaller patches. So then, in case you want to average, you don't cancel out the things. And depending on how you want to choose which option you choose, the scouts function you will need to apply could vary. You can use the mean of the inside each of the parcels or scouts. You have many time series. So you can do the mean. Be careful when you do the mean because of this thing that we said. Like if it's constrained, then you can have positive and negative. That's why sometimes we use the mean, we do absolute values and then we do the mean. But this can double the frequency, and maybe it's not that accurate if you are doing things related to the frequency, because if you have an oscillation like this and you do absolute values, then your frequency would be double. Another, and I think this is the most extended approach, is to use PCA, which then you get the first principal component, and you work with that, and then you have one signal, and you don't care that much about the how to combine everything and the sign of each signals. But it could be that different regions of interest has the PCA has a different sign, so maybe you have to look into it. So in case you at some point want to do anything, you PCA can give you just one component, you take it, but in one region can give you a positive, like this the sign flip it to positive or to negative. So this is something you can also take into account. And there are many other approaches. So for me, I think the most extended is to use PCA, but you can always choose depending on your data, on your question, on what you want to do. And most of the toolboxes and allows you to choose how you want to combine all the regions, all the signals in your region of interest. Also, once you have extracted your signals, you have done all your activations, another problem comes, and it's our brains are all different. So if we have used our individual anatomy to compute the sources, and you want to average out throughout a full group of brains, you will find that the sulcus and the gyres of different people are not the same. That's why we try to, a normal, usual approach, an extended approach, is to project the activation of a participant's individual brain into a sphere, and this sphere is mapped into a common template. In that, and then wrap it again into a default template. That way, we can project all the individual brains of all our participants into a common template, and then you can easily average, because now we are not destroying, and we have mapped all the activation into the respective regions. Okay, so you have a research question, then you measure, you pick your technique, and then you get your signals, you clean them and pre-process them. We've seen all these filtering, removing blinks, removing bad segments, removing bad channels. So then you have your clean data on the sensors, and you want to project to the sources, and you have one signal either from a sensor or from a source. And then you can do different types of analysis that we haven't seen throughout the workshop. We can study evoke potentials or induced activity, as Robert was mentioning yesterday. We can do some spectral analysis, and Natalie was also explaining yesterday, like measuring the frequency components, measuring the 1/f behavior. We can do some time frequency, which is how these frequencies change in time. Because when you do a spectral analysis, the time is fixed. It's like the whole region of the whole time period, the whole window. But here you can see time by time how these frequencies change. We can also study the waveform of our signals. Usually we assume that if we have oscillations, they are like 50% up, 50% down, and almost regular. But sometimes it's not the case. They have like shorter cycles, longer and extended periods. So analyzing this waveform is another kind of analysis you can do to any signal, preferably at the sensor level, at the source level, but also at the sensor level. And we can also study cross-coupling, um, cross-frequency coupling, which is maybe some different frequencies modulate the activity. That means that a slow component of frequency component can modulate when a fast is being activated. It's, for example, the theta gamma component cross-frequency coupling. You see, like whenever the signal is up, then you have fast oscillation, then nothing, and then fast again, and then nothing, and then so this is another way of analyzing your signals as studying the cross-frequency coupling. And what happens if instead of just one source, you have different sources? Then you can do some other types of multivariate approaches, like do study connectivity, which is what's the relation between these signals, and once you have the connectivity, you can also study networks. When we talk about connectivity, this is another thing I was asked to present today. Um, Even though we have to be very careful when we do connectivity at the with MEG and EEG data, because as you will find, it's not a thing that is really robust. So you have to really have a good hypothesis and test with careful. But I will anyways explain a few of a few ideas here. So we can have a structural connectivity that is really the physical tract that links two regions through white matter, and they are really physically linked. But however, when we study functional connectivity, the regions may not necessarily be structurally linked. So that means that there's a relation between the signals, things happen at the same time, and we say they are functionally connected, but it doesn't really necessarily mean that these are like physically connected. Um, during my PhD, I do a comprehensive review of many connectivity metrics. I put here the link. Okay, some metrics are based on classic concepts like Pearson correlation, where you establish a linear correlation in time between two signals. So imagine these two signals. They are very small, but I hope you can see them. So if we have a time point in a signal X and in the same time point in the Y signal, we do a plot. We plot it there where it should remain, and we do a dot. So if we keep on doing this throughout the time, we'll have a cloud of dots, and we can say, okay, these are correlated. The correlation is close to 1 because this is almost perfect. Whenever a signal increases, the signal in the other region also increases. Whenever it decreases, it decreases. We can also have negative correlation. That means someone increased, the other decreases, and they were in the case. And could be also that when you want to analyze, it's like no correlation. These are, almost randomly. The plots is like no correlation. Or they can have another relationship that we are not able to see because they don't follow a linear correlation. Could be also, there's another metric. I'm not going to present every metric here. It would be like super intense, and I also try to not to add the formulas, but there's another metric which is called cross correlation, which is, it could be that the signals are like correlated, but not at the same time. One is displaced against the other. So this is called cross correlation, and you can find like the time lag where these two signals are correlated. Maybe they are not at 0, but maybe after 20 milliseconds, they start becoming correlated. And also, we have the coherence, which is a very similar approach, but in the frequency domain. We don't analyze the time series, but the frequency spectrum. Okay. Oh, sorry. Well, So I'm going to introduce another concept, which is phase synchronization. Imagine you have a dog, and you want to go to a park and to walk your dog, and you go across you go around a lake. If you have your dog with you, whenever you go, the amplitude of the path you follow and your dog follows would be very, very related. So if we do a correlation, it will be correlated. But imagine you go alone and your dog goes alone. Uh, if we measure the amplitude of the signals of the girl and the dog, they may be not correlated. However, if we measure the phase, that is, how long does it take the girl to take a walk through one round through the lake, and the dog, they could be really, the phases could be really related. Could be the difference of phases would be really small and constant. So it doesn't need to follow exactly your same path, but it can have another different path but go at the same time. So this is the concept of phase synchronization. And if you, well, there are many metrics that study phase synchronization, like phase locking value. So here you want to analyze how the relative phase is distributed throughout the unit circle. So if you have a signal X and Y, you compute their phases at a certain frequency band, and you subtract them. And if they are every time you subtract the phases, it's constant around through here, like in this region, then you sum all the values and you get a large vector. However, if instead of being all constant, the difference instead of being constant is sometimes you have this phase difference, sometimes this other. So whenever you want to average, the result will be very small. In addition to the phase locking value, another metrics, well, there's many, but another idea is the phase lag index, where we have a problem in MEG and EEG, which is the volume conduction. So it could be that sometimes your phase are just constant or very close to 0 or to 1 pi because the signals come from the same planes. So in this case, the phase lag index sums not the values of the phases, but the sign. So if you have positive values, they were count 1, and if you have negative values, they count -1. So if you average, this would be 0. But what happens when they are around 0 or around pi, which is related in theory to 0 lag synchronization, then it's also 0. So you have prevented of having a large value of phase-locking, a large value of PLI just around 0 and around pi. So this is another way of studying phase synchronization. There's weighted phase lag index. There's many others, but just to give you a rough idea. There are other metrics that are based on Granger causality, which is if you have your signal and you take a few samples of your signal and you take another signal and you also take a few samples of your Y signal, if you are able to predict this Y signal with your own past worse than if you add the information from the past of another signal, like X, then you will say that your Granger causality, that you have Granger causality between the signals. That is, if the error I try to predict myself with my own past, and I get an error. And if the error, and then I divide this error by the error I have if with my past, but also with the past of, of the other signal. Well, this is a concept. It's not that one signal is causing the other. So its causality has to be like said with careful, but is that, yeah, with the past of another signal, you're able to predict your future a bit better. With this same concept, we have ranging causality in the most classical way in time domain, but we also have this in the frequency domain with the direct transfer function, and we also have some partials metric, like partial directed coherence and others. I will show you why this partialization is important, the same like with as we did to remove the zero lag synchronization. There are other metrics that are based on, sorry, the animation goes a bit disorganized. There are many metrics. These are the ones that I gathered in 2013. And there are many more other metrics that are being used. There are also ones based on information theory, like Shannon entropy, mutual information transfer entropy. The ideas, yeah, there are different ways. I just wanted you to know that you can do connectivity, be careful, and that many of these metrics, when you try to reproduce, it's sometimes not that easy. The thing that I was saying, like the volume conduction problem, it's especially important in MEG and EEG because the electromagnetic fields spread throughout the tissue. And you can find spurious correlations, like just because the activity of this is spread out through the tissues, and two other regions seems to have the same um, input, like coming from the same sources. That's why we do orthogonalization, or we do zero lag corrections to try to ignore zero lag correlations. And we also have to be careful with indirect connection. That's why some metrics try to partialize the influence of others. Like if you have a common driver, or well, let's start with this. If one is influencing two and two is influencing three, it may be that your method detects 1 to 3, but this is not real. This is just because it's going throughout another path. So this could be happening in your brain if you detect like some connection. Could be that it's because it's going through a third one. Also, in this case, if one is influencing 2 and one is influencing 3, you can find relationship between 2 and 3. But again, this might not be real. This is just because one is influencing the two, and it's similar to the volume conversion thing. So there are many metrics. Take with care, and this is how you will get a matrix of connectivity, and you can visualize in fancy way or not that fancy. When you do connectivity, you have two different ways of functional connectivity. The one that is not direct, it doesn't give you information about the direction, flow of information, and the matrices are symmetrical. Yeah, the relation between 1 and 2 is the same as 2 and 1. And we have directed metrics like effective connectivity, where you can have some kind of direction, and the matrices of this kind of measures are not symmetrical. So once you have these matrices, you can study many concepts that come from the complex networks. Like, for example, the degree, which is the number of links connected to a node, the strength, the sum of the weights a node is connected. The clustering is the likelihood of your neighbors also being connected. Like, I think in cutting EG, they are trying to make clusters very strong. So, and these are paths that you can follow. This is called a path when a line goes through different nodes. A walk when you have loops inside your path. And the shortest path, which is if you have many options, what's the shortest that goes through the minimal number of nodes? Well, the betweenness, which is the number of all shortest paths in the network that contain a specific node. Well, you will see that in the networks there are also many metrics, and it's useful. I study telecommunications engineering, so these are metrics that are very useful for networks of electricity, and sometimes we try to extrapolate these into the brain. I don't know if often works, but yeah, as John was saying this morning, like, well, all models are wrong, but some are useful. So you have to try to pick the ones that are useful for your analysis. And also we have the modularity, which is to maximize a network is very modular if it maximizes the within links and minimize between modules. So you have modules. And then this is a concept that was in fashion some time ago, which is like you can have a network which is a ring. This comes from another domain, but maybe useful here. Uh, um, what happens to a ring? If you lose a link between two nodes, then uh, it's really not very robust. You have to do again, going from a path to another, maybe take to a long trip. And there are, on the other side, there are complete networks where every node is connected to every other node, but this is also not very efficient because you imagine a network of electricity network, then you waste a lot of cable trying to link all the nodes, and maybe it's not that necessary. And that's why there are other topologies like lattice, where you just link the nodes that are closer, and or randomly just pick some cables. But there were some kind of networks that were called small networks, networks, which are like you have your neighbors connected, but also some random long distance connection. These make your network really efficient. And there's this law of the 7 nodes of separation, that is that you can connect to every person in the world only just by jumping 7 people. So if you think of a famous or the Pope, you could reach to the Pope just by adding 7 nodes of separation. Well, this. So, okay, you can study once you have your network of connectivity, you have many options to analyze it using complex, networks theory, and find the hubs, what are the regions that may be more important, and if they are destroyed, your networks falls apart, or what are more vulnerable on, yeah, some ideas for you to do in the future. And again, we come back. We have seen the most important thing is to have a very good research hypothesis. We shouldn't definitely we shouldn't be biased for, oh, I want to apply this new method. No, think well, because the methods are just tools for you to reach to a research question. So think well what you want to do, and then see if MEG and EEG is the best way to approach it. They have very good temporal resolution, spatial resolution. The spatial resolution is acceptable, and also using MRI, we can really reach to really decent spatial localization. Then you record your signals, clean it super thoroughly, and then move from the sensor to the sources, because you will gain the spatial resolution, and you will disentangle many things that could be linked inside. And then you can do whatever works best for you, or many options, because every analysis gives you a new approach and a new perspective of what you want to study, evoked potentials, spectral analysis, time frequency, waveform, cross-graph frequency, or if you have multiple signals, then you can do some connectivity or network analysis. I think with that, I finished the talk, and thank you very much for listening. And I hope I have shown you something that is useful for you.